and I'm going to be talking about fighting cholera in London in 1854. So public health problems in industrial Britain. The Industrial Revolution happened in Britain between 1760 and 1840. It saw lots of people move to cities and begin to work in manufacturing industries instead of agriculture or farming. Lots of people moved to cities because that is where most manufacturing jobs were located. Thousands of people migrated from the countryside to cities such as London, Birmingham, and Manchester. And for the first time, more people lived in British cities than the countryside. Living conditions in these cities. So most people living in cities lived in terrible living conditions. Workers lived in very small houses, and the houses were very close together, and sometimes families lived in one small room. Workers received very low wages, and they often lived in poverty. Water and sewage. Private toilets were rare. Most families used toilets outside the house, which were shared with others. Sewage would fall into a cesspit, which was often washed away by rain or thrown in rivers. Water came from local rivers, which is where sewage from cesspits often went. This was sometimes a worse situation than ancient Rome, which had aqueducts. The streets were also dirty with wastage and sewage. People's health may have been worse than any other time in history. Disease. Because of these poor conditions and overcrowding, disease was very common. Some of the worst diseases were typhoid, tuberculosis, and cholera. Typhoid was caused by contaminated food or water, and it was spread through unhygienic conditions. Tuberculosis was caused by germs spread by sneezing or coughing. It was spread through overcrowded areas. Cholera was caused by contaminated water or food. And the government. Local councils were usually responsible for these health problems. Some people thought government should intervene, but often they did not, because they had a laissez-faire approach, or a very laid-back approach. Local taxpayers made decisions, and many of these did not want to pay more money to improve health conditions for others in their town. So, as we've just learned, cholera was caused by contaminated water or food, tuberculosis by germs spread by sneezing or coughing, and typhoid was caused by contaminated food or water, which was spread through unhygienic conditions. So as we've just learned, we know that sewage would fall into a cesspit, which was often washed away by rain or thrown in rivers. Private toilets were rare. Most families used toilets outside the house, which were shared with others. And water came from local rivers, which is where the sewage from cesspits often went. Cholera epidemics. So cholera is a disease transmitted through water. At the time, people thought that it was produced by rubbish and human waste, and this was spread through the air in miasmas. Streets were cleaned, but water was often not clean. So the cholera epidemics in history affected Britain every few years between 1831 and 1866. Symptoms of cholera include vomiting and having painful diarrhea. Although governments were concerned about cholera epidemics, they did not know what caused cholera and therefore how to prevent it. After the cholera epidemics, Edwin Chadwick wrote a report on living conditions for the working classes in 1842. It was called the Report on the Sanitary Conditions of the Labouring Population. Chadwick thought that bad health was being caused by people's awful living conditions. He thought that the disease was being caused by bad air and damp. People were shocked by how bad living conditions were for the poor. Chadwick suggested that laws should improve drainage and sewer systems. He thought medical officers should be appointed to improve the situation for the poor. Although the explanation for disease was incorrect, Chadwick recognized the need to improve public hygiene, particularly the need for clean water and streets. Chadwick stressed that improving public health by raising taxes would benefit Britain, as the workforce would work harder and make more goods. The government's laissez-faire policy meant they did not take action following Chadwick's report. They believed that the government should not interfere in the poor's lives. Some towns, like Manchester and Liverpool, did improve their sewage and water systems. In 1848, Parliament passed an act that set up a Board of Health to encourage local councils to improve conditions. But many authorities did much did not do much. In 1872, there were only 50 medical officers of health appointed. It did not have a huge impact, and it was not compulsory. Cholera epidemics affected Britain every few years. So cholera epidemics affected Britain every few years between 1831 and 1866. So to recap about Edwin Chadwick, we know that he thought that bad health was being caused by people's awful living conditions. He wrote a report on living conditions for the working classes in 1842, and he thought that cholera was being caused by bad air and damp. Cholera and the work of Dr. John Snow. Dr. John Snow was born in 1813 and was a physician who examined the link between cholera and contaminated water after an outbreak of cholera in London in 1854. Dr. Snow saw that all the victims of the cholera epidemic in 1854 lived near the Broad Street water pump. He removed the pump's handle and forced everyone to use another pump. This stopped the spread of the disease in the area. Snow discovered that the pump's water had been contaminated by a leaking street toilet. This confirmed that cholera was not airborne, but waterborne. William Farr collected medical statistics that recorded how people died. Dr. Snow used Farr's statistics to see whether there was a link between water contamination with sewage and deaths from cholera. His statistics showed that deaths from cholera seemed to be linked to specific water sources. These statistics were very important to prove Dr. Snow's hypothesis. So if we recap what we've just learned, we know that Dr. John Snow discovered the link between cholera and contamination in 1854. So, what we've learned from cholera so far, we know that it seems to be linked to specific water sources, that statistics were used to see whether there's a link between water contaminated with sewage and deaths from cholera, and that William Farr collected medical statistics that recorded how people died. So the Industrial Revolution and the poor living conditions is closely related to cholera, and we know that the Industrial Revolution took place between 1760 and 1840. So some of the worst diseases in the urban areas at the time were cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis. As we've already discussed, the Public Health Act in 1870 was not many authorities reacted to this, and in 1872 there were only 50 medical officers of health appointed, which did not have a huge impact as it was not compulsory. So Dr. John Snow saw that all the victims of the cholera epidemic in 1854 lived near the Broad Street water pump. And this was important in his link between dirty water and cholera. Cholera epidemics were common in Britain in the Industrial Revolution. It still causes 100,000 deaths each year. Most of these happen in Africa, and a lack of clean water is a cause. So, in 1848, Parliament passed an act, the Public Health Act, that set up a Board of Health to encourage local councils to improve conditions. However, the government followed a laissez-faire approach, which meant that very few officials were appointed. Okay, so that brings this session to a close, as well as this topic on medicine in Britain. Thank you very much.